Rebecca sat on the old wooden bench outside Miller's General Store, watching the people of Willowbrook go about their daily lives. Once upon a time she had been one of them. She used to walk these same streets with her head held high, greeting neighbors with warm smiles and stopping to chat about the weather or the latest town news. But that was before everything changed. That was before the whispers started following her wherever she went. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street as Rebecca adjusted her worn shawl around her shoulders. She had been sitting there for nearly an hour, working up the courage to go inside the store. It shouldn't be this hard to buy a loaf of bread and some milk, but in Willowbrook, even the simplest tasks had become mountains to climb. Through the store window, she could see Mrs. Patterson arranging jars on the shelf. The older woman caught sight of Rebecca and quickly turned away, pretending to be busy with her work. Rebecca's heart sank a little deeper. Mrs. Patterson had once been like a second mother to her, always ready with a kind word and a piece of warm pie when Rebecca visited after church on Sundays. Now, Mrs. Patterson acted like Rebecca was carrying some terrible disease that might spread just by looking at her. The bell above the store door chimed as two women walked out, their shopping baskets full of goods. Rebecca recognized them immediately. They had been her closest friends not so long ago. They had shared secrets, laughed together, and planned their futures side by side. But when they saw Rebecca sitting on the bench, their faces changed. Their warm chatter stopped mid-sentence, and they hurried past without so much as a glance in her direction. One of them, Jenny, even pulled her skirt closer to her body, as if being near Rebecca might somehow stain the fabric. Rebecca felt the familiar sting of tears behind her eyes, but she blinked them away. She had learned not to cry in public anymore. The people of Willowbrook seemed to think her tears were just another sign of her supposed guilt. The truth was so different from what everyone believed. 6 months ago, Rebecca had been the town's pride and joy. Her father was the respected pastor of the local church, and she had been the Sunday school teacher who all the children adored. She had a job at the schoolhouse, teaching reading and writing to the younger ones. People often said she would make some lucky man a wonderful wife someday. Then came that terrible night when everything fell apart. Thomas Whitfield, the son of the richest family in town, had cornered her after a church social. He had been drinking, though nobody else seemed to notice. He had followed her outside when she went to get some fresh air. And what happened next still gave her nightmares. He had grabbed her arm, pulled her into the shadows behind the church, and tried to force himself on her. When she fought back and managed to escape, running home with her dress torn and her heart pounding, she thought the worst was over. She was wrong. The next morning, the story spreading through town was completely different. According to the Whitfield family, Rebecca had thrown herself at Thomas, trying to trap him into marriage. They said she had lured him outside and behaved in a way that no decent woman would. They painted her as desperate and shameless, willing to ruin her own reputation to catch a wealthy husband. Nobody asked for Rebecca's side of the story. Nobody seemed to care that the Whitfields were lying to protect their precious son. Thomas was set to inherit the family's vast holdings, and they couldn't let a scandal touch his name. So instead, they destroyed hers. Within a week, Rebecca had lost her teaching job. The school board said they couldn't have someone of questionable character around the children. Her father, under pressure from the church congregation, had been forced to ask her to step down from all her church duties. Even worse, some people suggested that maybe Pastor Mitchell wasn't fit to lead the church if he couldn't even raise his own daughter properly. Now, Rebecca lived like a ghost in her own hometown. She did washing and mending for the few people who would still hire her, working for coins instead of the steady salary she once earned. She shopped early in the morning or late in the evening, trying to avoid the crowds and the stares. The worst part wasn't the loneliness or even the poverty. It was the way people looked at her now, like she was something dirty that needed to be swept away. Children were pulled closer to their mothers when she passed by. Men either avoided her completely or looked at her with expressions that made her skin crawl, as if her supposed fall from grace meant she was available to anyone who wanted her. Rebecca stood up from the bench, straightening her simple blue dress. She had delayed long enough. Her father needed medicine for his cough, and they were down to their last few coins. She couldn't let pride or fear keep her from taking care of him. He was one of the few people who still believed in her innocence. though even he struggled under the weight of the town's judgment. As she reached for the store door, it opened and nearly knocked her backward. A man she didn't recognize stepped out, carrying a bag of supplies. He was tall and weathered, with kind eyes and clothes that marked him as someone who worked with his hands. When he saw that he had almost hit her, his face filled with genuine concern. "I'm so sorry, miss. Are you hurt?" he asked, reaching out to steady her. Rebecca was so surprised by his politeness that she could barely speak. When was the last time someone had called her miss instead of whispering "that woman" when they thought she couldn't hear? "No, I'm fine, thank you," she managed to say. The stranger tipped his hat to her and walked on down the street. Rebecca watched him go, wondering who he was and how long it would take before someone filled his ears with stories about her. She sighed and pushed open the store door, preparing herself for another round of cold stares and whispered judgments. As the bell chimed above her head, Rebecca couldn't have imagined that the polite stranger would soon change everything about her life in Willowbrook. She couldn't have known that someone had finally arrived who would see past the lies and rumors to the truth underneath. For now, all she could do was buy her father's medicine and make it through another day in a town that had decided she was guilty without ever giving her a chance to prove her innocence. The sun was barely up when Daniel Cooper rode into Willowbrook, leading a small group of cattle behind him. His horse's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust as they made their way down the main street. Most of the town was still asleep, but Daniel preferred it that way. He had learned that first impressions mattered, and arriving quietly gave him a chance to observe before people started asking questions. Daniel had traveled a long way from his ranch in Colorado. After losing his wife Maria to a fever 2 winters back, the familiar places had become too painful to bear. Every corner of his property reminded him of her laugh, her garden, the life they had planned together. His friends told him he needed to move on. But how do you move on from someone who was your whole world? So he had sold most of his land, kept his best cattle, and decided to start fresh somewhere new. Willowbrook looked promising from what he had heard. Good grazing land, reasonable prices, and a community that minded its own business. At least that's what the man in the last town had told him. As Daniel made his way through the quiet streets, he noticed a young woman walking ahead of him. She was carrying a basket and moving with purpose, like someone who had important things to do. There was something about the way she held herself that caught his attention. She walked with dignity, but there was also a carefulness to her steps, like she was trying not to be noticed. When she stopped at a small house with a well-tended garden, Daniel slowed his pace. He watched as she knocked softly on the door and waited. An elderly woman answered, her face lighting up with genuine joy when she saw her visitor. This was clearly someone the old woman trusted and cared about. "Rebecca, dear, you're here early today," the elderly woman said, loud enough for Daniel to hear as he passed. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson. I brought you some fresh bread from yesterday's baking, and I can help with your garden if you'd like," Rebecca replied. Her voice was gentle and kind, the sort of voice that would be good with children or anyone who needed comfort. Daniel continued on his way, but he found himself thinking about the scene. There was something special about a person who would visit elderly neighbors and bring them fresh bread. In his experience, that kind of kindness usually said a lot about someone's character. He spent the morning finding a place to settle his cattle and asking around about land for sale. The responses he got were helpful enough, but he noticed something odd. Whenever he mentioned seeing a young woman visiting Mrs. Patterson, people's faces would change. They would get uncomfortable and try to change the subject. "Oh, you mean Rebecca," one man finally said when Daniel pressed for more information. "Well, let's just say she's not the sort of person you'd want to associate with if you're planning to do business in this town." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" The man looked around nervously as if making sure no one was listening. "She got herself into trouble with the Whitfield boy. Threw herself at him, if you know what I mean. Made quite a scene. Her own father had to remove her from church duties." Something about the man's tone didn't sit right with Daniel. He had seen enough of the world to know that stories often got twisted in the telling, especially when they involved young women and wealthy families. Later that afternoon, Daniel found himself back at Miller's general store, picking up supplies he would need for his temporary camp. The store was busier now, with several women shopping and chatting among themselves. Their conversation stopped abruptly when Rebecca walked through the door. The change in atmosphere was immediate and uncomfortable. The women stepped away from Rebecca as if she carried some kind of disease. One of them, a well-dressed woman with sharp features, made a loud comment that was clearly meant for everyone to hear. "Some people have no shame, showing their faces in decent company," the woman said, her voice dripping with disdain. Rebecca's cheeks turned red, but she kept her head up and walked to the counter. "Mr. Miller, I need a bottle of medicine for my father's cough, please," she said quietly. The shopkeeper looked around nervously at the other customers before responding. "That'll be $2, he said, naming a price that Daniel knew was at least double what the medicine usually cost. Rebecca's face fell slightly, but she began counting out coins from a small purse. Daniel could see that she was struggling to come up with the full amount. The other women in the store were watching with expressions that ranged from satisfaction to disgust. I only have $1.60 today," Rebecca said quietly. "Could I possibly pay the rest next week when I get paid for my mending work?" The well-dressed woman laughed harshly. "I suppose next you'll be asking for charity, though I can't imagine why anyone would want to help someone like you." That was enough for Daniel. He had seen bullying before, and he had no patience for people who kicked others when they were down. He stepped forward to the counter, pulling out his wallet. "I'll cover the difference," he said calmly, placing the extra money on the counter, "and I'll take a bottle of that same medicine for myself." The store went completely silent. Everyone was staring at him like he had just announced he was planning to rob the bank. Rebecca looked up at him with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "You don't understand, mister," the well-dressed woman said, her voice sharp with warning. "You're new here, so you don't know what kind of person she is." Daniel turned to face the woman, his expression calm but firm. "Ma'am, I know exactly what kind of person I'm looking at. I'm looking at someone who visits elderly neighbors and brings them fresh bread, someone who works hard to take care of her sick father, someone who's being treated poorly by people who ought to know better." The woman's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She clearly wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a stranger. Daniel turned back to Rebecca, who was still standing frozen at the counter. "Miss, would you mind if I walked you home? I'm new in town and I could use someone to point out the landmarks." For a moment, Rebecca just stared at him. Then slowly she nodded. Yes, that would be fine. Thank you." As they left the store together, Daniel could hear the excited whispers starting up behind them. He knew that by evening, the whole town would be talking about the stranger who had defended Rebecca. He also knew that this would probably make his own life in Willowbrook more complicated. But as they walked down the dusty street, and Rebecca quietly pointed out the church, the school, and the main businesses, Daniel found that he didn't care about the complications. There was something about this young woman that reminded him of his late wife. Not in looks, but in spirit. Maria had also been the kind of person who helped others, who stayed strong even when life was difficult. And if Daniel had learned anything from losing Maria, it was that good people were rare and precious. When you found them, you protected them, regardless of what anyone else thought. As they reached the small house where Rebecca lived with her father, she turned to thank him again. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "People will talk about you now." Daniel smiled, the first real smile he had managed in months. "Miss Rebecca, I found that the kind of people who talk badly about acts of kindness aren't usually worth worrying about." And with that, he tipped his hat and walked away, already planning his next visit to Willowbrook's Main Street. 3 days had passed since Daniel's encounter at the general store, and he found himself thinking about Rebecca more than he probably should. There was something about her quiet dignity in the face of such cruel treatment that reminded him of his own struggles after Maria's death. People had whispered then too, some saying he should have done more to save her, others suggesting that maybe God was punishing him for some unknown sin. Daniel had set up a temporary camp just outside of town while he looked for permanent land to buy. His cattle were grazing peacefully in a rented field, and he had spent his time getting to know the area. But every morning he found his feet taking him toward town around the time when Rebecca made her rounds. On Thursday morning, he saw her coming out of Mrs. Patterson's house carrying an empty basket. She looked tired, and Daniel noticed that her dress, while clean and well-mended, was worn thin in several places. When she saw him approaching, she stopped and gave him a small, hesitant smile. "Good morning, Mr. Cooper," she said. Are you settling in well? Please call me Daniel, he replied, falling into step beside her. And yes, I'm finding everything I need. Though I have to admit I could use some help organizing my supplies. I'm not much good at keeping track of household things. Rebecca looked surprised. You need help organizing supplies? Well, I've got food stores, medical supplies, tools, and equipment all mixed together in my wagon. My late wife used to handle that sort of thing, and I never learned her system. Daniel paused, then added, I'd be willing to pay fair wages for someone to help me sort it all out properly. He watched as Rebecca's face went through several emotions. Hope, suspicion, and then something that looked like fear. Daniel, that's very kind of you, but people would talk. They already think poorly of me. And if they saw me working for a single man? She trailed off, her cheeks turning pink. What if we worked outside, in full view of anyone who wanted to watch? And what if I asked Mrs. Patterson to come sit with us while we worked? Would that make it more proper? Rebecca stopped walking and looked at him closely. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't know if what people say about me is true or not. Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. Can I tell you something about myself, Rebecca? She nodded. When my wife got sick, I spent every penny I had on doctors and medicines. I sat by her bedside for weeks, barely sleeping, trying everything I could think of to help her get better. When she died anyway, some people in my old town started saying that maybe I hadn't tried hard enough. Maybe I cared more about my cattle than my wife. Maybe God took her because I was too proud or too selfish. Rebecca's eyes widened with sympathy. That's terrible. How could they say such things? Because people need someone to blame when bad things happen. It makes them feel safer to think that if they just behave the right way, tragedy won't touch them. Daniel looked at her directly. I learned that sometimes the people who get blamed are the ones who least deserve it. They had reached the edge of town where Daniel's wagon was parked. Rebecca stood looking at it for a long moment. I could really use the work, she admitted quietly. Father's medicine is expensive, and I haven't been able to find much sewing to do lately. Then let's go ask Mrs. Patterson if she'd like to sit in the sunshine and supervise our work. Daniel said with a smile. Mrs. Patterson was delighted to be included. She brought her knitting and settled into a comfortable chair that Daniel provided, chattering happily as Rebecca and Daniel began sorting through his supplies. As they worked, Daniel learned more about Rebecca's situation. She told him about her job at the school and how much she had loved teaching the children to read. She mentioned her work at the church and how it had felt like her calling in life. And slowly, carefully, she told him about the night that changed everything. Thomas Whitfield cornered me behind the church after the social, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He had been drinking and he tried to force himself on me. When I fought him off and ran home, I thought that was the end of it. But the next day, his family was telling everyone that I had thrown myself at him. Daniel's hands tightened on the medical supplies he was sorting, but his voice remained calm. Did you tell anyone what really happened? I tried to tell my father, but by then the whole town was buzzing with the Whitfield version of events. People said I was just trying to cover up my shameful behavior. The Whitfields are the richest family in the county. Who was going to believe the pastor's daughter over them? Mrs. Patterson looked up from her knitting. I always wondered about that story, she said thoughtfully. Rebecca has been helping me for years, ever since she was a little girl. Never took a penny for it. Never asked for anything in return. Doesn't seem like the behavior of someone with loose morals. Rebecca looked surprised. Mrs. Patterson, you believe me? The elderly woman smiled sadly. Dear child, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. I know your character, but I'm just one old woman. My opinion doesn't carry much weight in this town. As the afternoon wore on, Daniel found himself more and more impressed with Rebecca's intelligence and organization skills. She created a system for his supplies that was both practical and efficient. She also showed a knowledge of medicine and first aid that would be valuable on a ranch. Where did you learn so much about treating injuries? He asked as she organized his medical kit. I helped the town doctor sometimes before. She gestured vaguely. He used to let me assist with simple cases. I was thinking about asking him to train me as a proper nurse, but that was before my reputation was ruined. What about now? Have you asked him recently? Rebecca laughed, but there was no humor in it. Dr. Williams won't even acknowledge me when we pass on the street. His wife made it very clear that he couldn't be associated with someone like me. Daniel felt anger building in his chest, but he kept it controlled. Getting angry wouldn't help Rebecca, and it might scare her away. As the sun began to set, they finished organizing the last of the supplies. Daniel paid Rebecca generously for her work, more than she had expected, but not so much that it seemed like charity. "This system you've created is perfect," he told her honestly. "I could use help like this on a regular basis. I'm planning to buy land and build a proper ranch. Would you be interested in working for me permanently?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "Daniel, I can't ask you to risk your reputation for me. Once people know you're employing me regularly, they'll stop doing business with you." "Let me worry about my reputation," Daniel said gently. "I'm more concerned about finding good people to work with. Everything I've seen today tells me you're exactly the kind of person I'd want on my ranch." Mrs. Patterson packed up her knitting and stood to leave. "Young man," she said to Daniel, "you're either very brave or very foolish. But either way, you're doing the right thing." As they prepared to part ways, Rebecca looked at Daniel with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. "And please don't tell me it's just because you need help with your supplies." Daniel was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer honestly without saying too much. "Because everyone deserves a chance to rebuild their life," he said finally. "Because kindness should be rewarded, not punished. And because I think you're a good person who's been treated badly by people who should know better." Rebecca smiled then, the first truly happy smile he had seen from her. "Thank you, Daniel, for the work, for believing me, and for treating me like I'm still worth something." "Rebecca," Daniel said seriously, "you are worth everything. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." As he watched her walk home in the fading light, Daniel realized that for the first time since Maria's death, he was looking forward to tomorrow. 2 weeks had passed since Rebecca started helping Daniel organize his ranch supplies, and something remarkable was happening. For the first time in months, she was walking through Willowbrook with her shoulders straight and her head held high. The steady work had given her not just money for necessities, but something far more valuable, a sense of purpose and dignity. Daniel had been true to his word about making their working arrangement proper and above board. Every morning, Mrs. Patterson would join them, sometimes bringing other elderly neighbors who enjoyed the company. The work itself had expanded beyond simple organization. Rebecca was helping Daniel plan the layout for his future ranch, manage his accounts, and even treat minor injuries when his cattle got into scrapes. But the change in Rebecca hadn't gone unnoticed by everyone in town, and not all the attention was welcome. On a busy Saturday morning, Rebecca was walking through the town square when she heard someone call her name loudly. She turned to see Jenny Morrison, one of her former friends, standing with 2 other women near the fountain. "Rebecca," Jenny called out again, her voice carrying across the square. "We heard you found yourself a job with that new cowboy. How convenient for you." The way Jenny said convenient made it clear she wasn't offering congratulations. Rebecca felt her cheeks burn, but she forced herself to walk over to the group instead of hurrying away, like she might have done a month ago. "Hello, Jenny," Rebecca said calmly. "Yes, I'm helping Mr. Cooper with his ranch planning. It's honest work." "I'm sure it is," said Martha Wells, another woman in the group, "though people are wondering exactly what kind of planning you're doing with him, especially since you seem to be spending so much time together." Rebecca felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach, but before she could respond, a familiar voice spoke up behind her. "Ladies," Daniel said, his tone polite but firm, "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." The 3 women looked startled. They clearly hadn't expected him to appear. "Mr. Cooper," Jenny said, her voice suddenly sweet, "we were just chatting with Rebecca about her new employment." "That's good to hear," Daniel replied, "because I'd hate to think that anyone in this town would spread rumors about a hardworking woman who's helping an honest businessman get established in their community." Martha Wells lifted her chin defiantly. "We're just concerned about propriety, Mr. Cooper. Surely you understand that people talk when a single man employs a woman with Rebecca's reputation." "You're absolutely right that people talk," Daniel said, his voice still calm but with an edge to it. "The question is whether they talk about things that are true or things that are convenient to believe." He looked directly at each of the women in turn. "I've employed Miss Rebecca for 2 weeks now. In that time, she's shown more intelligence, work ethic, and moral character than I've seen from many people who consider themselves pillars of the community. She's helped me plan a ranch that will bring jobs and prosperity to this area, She's organized my affairs so efficiently that I've been able to complete in days what would have taken me weeks alone. Jenny shifted uncomfortably. Well, of course, we're not questioning her abilities. Good, Daniel said. Because I'd hate to think that good people in this town would judge someone based on rumors rather than evidence. Especially when those rumors come from people who might have their own reasons for wanting to damage someone's reputation. The three women exchanged glances. Martha Wells looked like she wanted to say something else, but something in Daniel's expression stopped her. We should be going, Jenny said quickly. Good day, Mr. Cooper. Rebecca. As the women hurried away, Rebecca realized she was trembling slightly. But it wasn't from fear or embarrassment this time. It was from relief and something that felt like gratitude. You didn't have to do that, she said to Daniel. Yes, I did, he replied simply. People who spread cruel gossip count on others being too polite to challenge them. Sometimes you have to make it clear that their behavior isn't acceptable. As they walked toward Daniel's camp, Rebecca found herself thinking about how much had changed in just 2 weeks. Having steady work had given her back some financial security. But more than that, having someone believe in her had given her back her confidence. Daniel, she said suddenly, I want to show you something. She led him to a small building at the edge of town that had once been her pride and joy, the schoolhouse where she had taught. It had been empty since the school board dismissed her, and weeds were starting to grow around the foundation. This is where I used to work, she said, looking up at the simple wooden building. I loved teaching those children. Some of them were just learning their letters when I started, and by the time I had to leave, they were reading whole books. Daniel studied the building thoughtfully. What happened to the children's education after you left? They brought in a teacher from the next county, but she only comes 3 days a week. The rest of the time the children just do without. That's a shame, Daniel said. Education is important, especially in towns like this. Children need to learn reading and writing if they're going to have opportunities beyond what their parents had. Rebecca nodded, feeling a familiar pang of loss. I keep thinking about little Amy Henderson, Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter. She was so eager to learn, and she had real talent for reading, but now she only gets to attend school 3 days a week. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Then Daniel spoke up. Once I get my ranch established, I'm going to need someone to help manage the business side of things. Keeping books, writing correspondence, maybe even teaching some of the ranch hands to read and write better. It seems to me like those are exactly the skills you have. Rebecca looked at him with surprise. You'd really want me to do that kind of work? Rebecca, in the past 2 weeks, you've shown me that you're organized, intelligent, and good with people. You understand business, you know how to teach, and you're not afraid of hard work. Why wouldn't I want you to handle the important parts of my operation? Just then they heard voices approaching. Rebecca turned to see Thomas Whitfield walking toward them with 2 other men. Her heart immediately started racing, and she took an instinctive step closer to Daniel. Thomas looked just as arrogant and entitled as always, his expensive clothes and confident swagger marking him as someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. When he saw Rebecca and Daniel together, his expression darkened. Cooper, Thomas said as he approached, ignoring Rebecca completely. I think it's time we had a conversation. About what? Daniel replied, his voice neutral but alert. About your business prospects in this town. You see, my family has considerable influence here. We can make things very easy for someone trying to get established, or we can make things very difficult. Thomas glanced at Rebecca with disdain. Associating with certain people might give folks the wrong impression about your judgment. Bad for business, if you know what I mean. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying Thomas's face. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but unmistakably firm. Mr. Whitfield, I appreciate you taking the time to introduce yourself, but I should probably mention that I make business decisions based on facts, not opinions, and the facts tell me that Miss Rebecca is one of the most capable and trustworthy people I've met since coming to Willowbrook. Thomas's face flushed red. You don't understand the situation here, Cooper. That woman, Daniel interrupted, has a name, and you'll use it when speaking about her in my presence. The 2 men stared at each other for a tense moment. Finally, Thomas smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. I see you need time to think about what's best for your future here. I hope you make the right choice, Cooper. For your sake. As Thomas and his companions walked away, Rebecca realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out slowly, amazed that someone had actually stood up to the most powerful family in town on her behalf. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel looked down at her with a gentle smile. "Rebecca, you don't ever have to thank me for treating you with respect. That should just be normal." As they walked back toward town, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just for employment or financial security, but for the possibility that she might actually have a future worth looking forward to. And walking beside her was a man who saw her as worthy of respect and protection, regardless of what anyone else thought. For the first time since her world fell apart, Rebecca began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could build something new and better from the pieces. The autumn morning was crisp and clear when Rebecca received the urgent message that would change everything. She was helping Daniel review potential ranch properties when young Billy Thompson came running up to them, out of breath and wide-eyed. "Miss Rebecca," the boy gasped. "Mrs. Patterson needs you right away. She's taken real sick and she's asking for you special." Rebecca's heart clenched with worry. Mrs. Patterson had been like a grandmother to her, one of the few people who had shown her kindness even during the worst of times. She quickly gathered her shawl and medicine bag. Over the weeks, she had put together a small collection of herbs and remedies for the elderly people she helped. "Go ahead," Daniel said immediately. "I'll finish up here and check on you later." The walk to Mrs. Patterson's house felt like the longest of Rebecca's life. When she arrived, she found Dr. Williams already there, which surprised her. The doctor had barely acknowledged her existence since her reputation was ruined. But when he saw her come in, he looked relieved rather than uncomfortable. "Rebecca, thank goodness," he said quietly. "She's been asking for you specifically. She won't settle down until she sees you." Mrs. Patterson looked small and frail in her bed, but her eyes were still sharp and determined. When she saw Rebecca, she reached out with a trembling hand. "Rebecca, dear child, come close. I need to tell you something important before it's too late." Rebecca knelt beside the bed, taking the old woman's hand in hers. "I'm here, Mrs. Patterson. What is it?" "I should have spoken up months ago," Mrs. Patterson whispered, her voice urgent despite its weakness. "I was too much of a coward, too afraid of what the Whitfields might do to me. But I can't meet my maker without setting the record straight." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Patterson's grip tightened on Rebecca's hand. "That night at the church social when all the trouble started. I saw what really happened, child. I saw it all." The room seemed to hold its breath. Even Dr. Williams stopped what he was doing to listen. "I had stepped outside for some air," Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice growing stronger with determination. "My old bones don't handle crowded rooms well anymore. I was sitting on the bench behind the church when I heard voices. I saw that Whitfield boy follow you outside, saw him grab your arm when you tried to get away from him." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "You saw him attack me?" "I saw him corner you. Saw you fighting him off, saw you run away with your dress torn. I heard him cursing after you, angry that you had gotten away from him." Mrs. Patterson's voice was firm now, despite her physical weakness. "And I saw him straighten his clothes and go back inside like nothing had happened. Why didn't you say anything?" Dr. Williams asked gently. Mrs. Patterson looked ashamed. "Because I'm an old woman who depends on the charity of this community to survive. The Whitfields own half the businesses in town. I was afraid they'd make sure I had nowhere to live, no one to help me. I thought surely someone else would speak up for Rebecca. I thought the truth would come out on its own." She turned back to Rebecca, tears flowing down her weathered cheeks. "But when I saw how they destroyed your reputation, how they turned the whole town against you, I knew I was a coward. I've been carrying this guilt for months, watching you suffer for something you didn't do." Mrs. Patterson reached over to her bedside table with great effort and pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. "Help me sit up, Dr. Williams. I need to write this down while I still can." "Mrs. Patterson, you should rest," the doctor protested. "I'll rest when this is done," she said firmly. "Rebecca, help me with the words. My hands shake too much to write clearly anymore." For the next hour, Mrs. Patterson dictated while Rebecca carefully wrote down everything the old woman had witnessed that night. She described seeing Thomas Whitfield follow Rebecca outside, described the struggle she witnessed, and described Thomas's behavior afterward. She included details that only someone who had actually been there could know. The time, the weather, even what Rebecca had been wearing. When they finished, Mrs. Patterson insisted on signing the letter with her own shaking hand. Dr. Williams served as a witness, adding his signature and the date. "There," Mrs. Patterson said, settling back against her pillows. "Now people will know the truth." "But Mrs. Patterson," Rebecca said worriedly, "what if the Whitfields retaliate against you for this?" The old woman smiled weakly. "Child, I'm 83 years old and sick enough that the good doctor here won't meet my eyes when I ask about my prospects. What can they do to me now that God isn't already planning to do?" Dr. Williams cleared his throat. "Mrs. Patterson, I think you should know that you're not the only person who's been carrying guilt about this situation." Both women looked at him in surprise. "I've known Rebecca since she was a little girl," he continued. "I've seen her character, her kindness, her moral fiber. When the story about Thomas Whitfield came out, I never believed she was capable of the behavior they described. But I was afraid to speak up because—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Because the Whitfields control too much of this town's economy," Mrs. Patterson finished for him. "Exactly. And I'm ashamed to say that I chose my financial security over doing what was right." Dr. Williams turned to Rebecca. "But there's something else you should know. You're not the only young woman Thomas Whitfield has bothered. Over the years, I've treated several girls for their injuries that happened after encounters with him, but their families were too afraid to speak up, just like I was too afraid to connect the dots publicly." Rebecca felt sick to her stomach. "You mean there were others?" "At least 3 that I know of personally, and probably more who never came to me for treatment." Mrs. Patterson struggled to sit up again. "Then this letter needs to mention that too." "Rebecca, add a note that Dr. Williams has information about other incidents." As Rebecca added the additional information to the letter, she felt a mixture of vindication and horror. Vindication that the truth was finally coming out, but horror that other women had suffered while Thomas Whitfield faced no consequences for his actions. "What do I do with this letter?" Rebecca asked when they finished. "You take it to that cowboy of yours," Mrs. Patterson said with a weak smile. "That young man has more backbone than any other person in this town. If anyone can figure out how to use this information to set things right, it's him." Dr. Williams nodded in agreement. "Daniel Cooper has already shown that he's not afraid of the Whitfields, and he's established enough now that they can't just run him out of town without consequences." As Rebecca prepared to leave, Mrs. Patterson called her back one more time. "Rebecca, dear, I want you to promise me something. Anything." "Mrs. Patterson, promise me you won't let them silence this truth again. Promise me you'll find the courage to speak up even if it's scary. You've been carrying this burden alone for too long." Rebecca folded the letter carefully and placed it in her bag. "I promise, Mrs. Patterson. The truth is going to come out no matter what it costs." As she walked quickly toward Daniel's camp, Rebecca's mind was racing. She had the proof she needed to clear her name, but she also knew that using it would mean going to war with the most powerful family in the county. The Whitfields wouldn't just accept this quietly. They would fight back with everything they had. But for the first time in months, Rebecca felt truly strong. She had the truth on her side, a witness willing to speak up, and most importantly, she had Daniel Cooper, a man who had shown her that she was worth fighting for. The time for hiding and accepting injustice was over. It was time to reclaim her life and her reputation, regardless of the consequences. When she reached Daniel's camp and saw him working with his cattle, she called out to him with more confidence in her voice than she had felt in months. "Daniel, I need to talk to you. I have something that's going to change everything." He looked up at the tone in her voice and saw immediately that something significant had happened. Dropping his work, he walked over to meet her, ready to hear whatever news she brought. And as Rebecca began to tell him about Mrs. Patterson's confession, she realized that she was no longer the frightened, broken woman who had been sitting alone outside the general store just weeks ago. She was someone with allies, with proof, and with the determination to fight for justice. The real battle was just beginning. The letter sat on Daniel's camp table like a loaded weapon, its contents having the power to destroy the most influential family in Willowbrook. After Rebecca finished telling him about Mrs. Patterson's confession, they both stared at the carefully written testimony in silence, understanding the weight of what they now possessed. "This changes everything," Daniel said finally, his voice serious. "With Mrs. Patterson's testimony and Dr. Williams as a witness, you have the proof you need to clear your name completely." Rebecca nodded, but her expression was troubled. "I know. But Daniel, if we use this letter, we're not just challenging Thomas Whitfield. We're going up against his entire family, their business empire, their political connections. They could destroy your chances of building a ranch here. They could make life impossible for anyone who supports us." Daniel leaned back in his chair considering the implications. The Whitfields owned the largest bank in the county, had investments in most of the major businesses, and held significant influence over local politics. Taking them on wasn't just risky, it could be financial suicide for anyone trying to establish themselves in the area. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked Rebecca gently. She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. "For months I've dreamed of having proof like this. I've imagined what it would feel like to walk through town with my head high again, to have people acknowledge that they were wrong about me. But now that I actually have the chance—" "You're scared," Daniel finished for her. "Terrified," she admitted. "Not just for myself, but for you, for Mrs. Patterson, for Dr. Williams. The Whitfields don't forgive people who cross them. Look what they did to me just for fighting off their son's attack. What will they do when we accuse them publicly of destroying an innocent woman's reputation?" Daniel stood up and walked to the edge of his camp, where he could see the town of Willowbrook in the distance. Smoke was rising from chimneys as families prepared their evening meals. Children were playing in yards, and life was continuing its normal rhythm. It looked peaceful and innocent, but he knew that beneath the surface, corruption and fear were keeping good people silent while evil went unpunished. "Rebecca," he said, turning back to her, "can I tell you what I think about courage?" She nodded, wanting to hear his perspective. "I used to think courage meant not being afraid. When I was younger, I thought brave people just didn't feel fear the way everyone else did. But when Maria was dying, I learned something different. I was terrified every day, terrified of losing her, terrified of being alone, terrified that I wasn't doing enough to help her. But I got up every morning anyway and did everything I could to take care of her." Daniel sat back down across from Rebecca. "Real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing even when you're scared. It's standing up for what's true even when it costs you something important. But what if it costs you everything?" Rebecca asked quietly. "Then at least you'll know you didn't compromise your principles to keep what you had." "Rebecca, I could build a successful ranch here by staying quiet and letting the Whitfields continue their reign of intimidation. But what kind of success would that be? What kind of man would I be if I knew the truth and chose to stay silent, just to protect my business interests?" As they talked, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. In the distance, they could hear the church bell ringing, calling people to evening prayers. Rebecca realized with a start what day it was. "Daniel, tomorrow is Founders' Day. The whole town will gather at the church for the annual celebration." Founders' Day was Willowbrook's most important community event, when everyone came together to celebrate the town's history and recognize outstanding members of the community. It was also traditionally when young people announced engagements and when community leaders made important announcements. "That's perfect timing," Daniel said thoughtfully. "Perfect? How is that perfect?" "It means the Whitfields will be there in force, probably announcing something important to remind everyone of their power and influence." Daniel picked up the letter and held it carefully. "It also means the entire community will be gathered in one place. If we're going to tell the truth, shouldn't we tell it when everyone can hear it at once?" Rebecca felt her heart start pounding. "You mean make Mrs. Patterson's letter public at the Founders' Day celebration?" "I mean give you a chance to reclaim your reputation in front of the same community that condemned you. I mean showing Thomas Whitfield that he can't destroy innocent people without consequences." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. For months, Rebecca had been invisible at community gatherings, sitting in the back and trying not to be noticed. The thought of standing up in front of everyone, of demanding to be heard, seemed almost impossible. "I don't know if I'm brave enough for that," she whispered. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. "You've already shown more bravery than most people ever will. You survived months of cruel treatment without becoming bitter or cruel yourself. You kept your dignity when everyone around you was trying to take it away. You continued helping others even when you had every reason to focus only on your own troubles. But this is different. This is your chance to stop hiding and start fighting back. Rebecca, you have truth on your side. You have witnesses. You have proof. And you have people who believe in you and will stand with you." They sat in contemplative silence as the last light faded from the sky. Rebecca knew that Daniel was right about the opportunity that Founders' Day presented, but she also knew the risks involved. The Whitfields would not take public humiliation lightly, and they had the resources to make life very difficult for anyone who opposed them. "If I do this," she said finally, "if I stand up tomorrow and tell the truth publicly, there's no going back. The Whitfields will see it as a declaration of war." "Yes," Daniel agreed. "But Rebecca, this war started months ago when they chose to destroy your reputation rather than hold their son accountable for his actions. You've just been fighting it alone and defensively. Tomorrow could be the day you start fighting back." Rebecca thought about Mrs. Patterson, weak and dying but still finding the courage to write down the truth. She thought about Dr. Williams, finally admitting that his silence had been wrong. She thought about the other young women who had suffered at Thomas Whitfield's hands, still too afraid to speak up. What if no one believes us? What if people think Mrs. Patterson was confused or lying? Then at least we'll know we tried. At least we'll know we didn't let fear keep us from doing what was right. Daniel stood up and looked toward the town again. "But I don't think that's what will happen. I think there are a lot of people in Willowbrook who have doubts about the official story. People who know your character and have been uncomfortable with how you've been treated. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to speak the truth out loud to give others permission to admit what they've been thinking privately." Rebecca felt something shifting inside her, a spark of the determination she had once possessed when she was teaching children and helping at the church. For too long she had accepted other people's judgments about her worth. For too long she had let fear and shame dictate her actions. "If I'm going to do this," she said, her voice growing stronger, "I want to do it right. I want to stand up in that church and tell my story clearly and completely. I want everyone to hear the truth, not just about what Thomas Whitfield did to me, but about how this community chose to believe lies rather than seek the truth." Daniel smiled, recognizing the return of the brave, principled woman that Rebecca had always been underneath the fear and shame. "Then that's what we'll do. Tomorrow you'll tell your story, and I'll be right there beside you to make sure everyone hears it." As they made plans for the next day, Rebecca felt a mixture of terror and excitement, unlike anything she had experienced since her world fell apart. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or complete disaster, but either way she would finally stop being a victim and start being someone who fought for justice. The time for hiding was over. Tomorrow the whole truth would finally be told. The morning of Founders Day dawned clear and bright, but Rebecca's hands shook as she put on her best dress, a simple blue one that she had mended carefully to hide the worn spots. In just a few hours she would either reclaim her reputation or face complete social destruction. There was no middle ground left. Daniel arrived at her house early, looking steady and determined in his clean clothes and polished boots. He had spent the morning making sure Mrs. Patterson was comfortable, and that Dr. Williams would be present at the church to support their testimony if needed. "How are you feeling?" he asked as they walked toward the church together. "Like I might faint or run away at any moment," Rebecca admitted, "but also like I can't wait another day to tell the truth." The church was already filling up when they arrived. Founders Day was the biggest social event of the year, when families came in from the surrounding farms and everyone dressed in their finest clothes. Children ran around the churchyard while their parents caught up on news and gossip. Rebecca noticed the looks and whispers that followed her as she walked through the crowd. But for the first time in months, she didn't shrink away from the attention. She held her head up and walked purposefully, with Daniel steady and protective beside her. Inside the church, the Whitfield family occupied their usual prominent pew near the front. Thomas sat between his parents, looking confident and self-satisfied. He was dressed in an expensive new suit, and Rebecca could see that he had been preparing for some kind of announcement. Rebecca and Daniel took seats in the middle section, close enough to be clearly seen but not so far forward as to seem presumptuous. As more people filed in, Rebecca recognized many faces from her former life, fellow teachers, church members, families whose children she had taught. Some avoided her eyes, but others nodded politely, and a few even managed small smiles. Pastor Mitchell, Rebecca's father, stood at the front of the church to begin the service. He looked older and more tired than he had before the scandal, and Rebecca felt a pang of guilt for the stress her situation had caused him. But she also knew that clearing her name would help restore his standing in the community as well. The service began with hymns and prayers, followed by the traditional recognition of community members who had made significant contributions during the past year. The Whitfields were praised for their continued support of local businesses. and several other prominent families received acknowledgement for various charitable works. Then came the moment Rebecca had been both dreading and anticipating. Pastor Mitchell announced that members of the community were welcome to share thoughts about the moral character and future of Willowbrook's young people. Mr. Whitfield stood up immediately, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "Pastor Mitchell, fellow citizens," he began in his booming voice, "I'm proud to announce that my son Thomas has become engaged to Miss Catherine Fairchild of Riverside County. The wedding will take place next spring, uniting two families with long histories of service to our community." The church erupted in polite applause. Thomas stood and nodded graciously, playing the part of the respectable young man perfectly. Rebecca felt sick watching the performance, knowing what kind of person he really was beneath the polite facade. "Furthermore," Mr. Whitfield continued, "I want to take this opportunity to speak about the importance of moral character in our young people. In recent months, we've seen how quickly a person's reputation can be damaged by poor choices and questionable behavior. Let this serve as a reminder that actions have consequences, and that those who maintain their virtue and integrity will always find their proper place in our community." Rebecca realized with growing anger that Mr. Whitfield was using this moment to take another shot at her reputation, to remind everyone of her supposed shame while celebrating his son's virtue. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. She looked around the church and saw people nodding along with Mr. Whitfield's words. These were good people, many of them, but they had been manipulated into believing lies. They had no idea that they were applauding a man who had covered up his son's crimes while destroying an innocent woman's life. When Mr. Whitfield finished speaking and sat down, Pastor Mitchell asked if anyone else wished to address the congregation. The church was quiet for a moment, and Rebecca felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Then Daniel stood up. "Pastor Mitchell," he said in a clear, carrying voice, "I'd like to speak about moral character as well." A murmur ran through the congregation. Many people knew who Daniel was by now, but having a relative newcomer speak at Founders' Day was unusual. "Please, Mr. Cooper," Pastor Mitchell said, gesturing for Daniel to continue. Daniel stepped into the aisle and turned to face the congregation. "I've been in Willowbrook for several weeks now, and I've had the chance to observe the character of many people in this community. I've seen kindness and generosity, but I've also seen how quickly people can turn against one of their own, based on rumors and gossip." Rebecca watched as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked confused about where Daniel was going with his speech, while others seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. "True moral character," Daniel continued, "isn't about maintaining appearances or protecting family reputation. It's about standing up for truth even when it's difficult. It's about defending the innocent even when it's inconvenient." The Whitfield family was beginning to look uncomfortable. Thomas's confident expression was fading, replaced by something that looked like worry. Daniel walked to the back of the church, where Rebecca was sitting with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every eye in the building followed him. "Miss Rebecca," he said, extending his hand to her, "would you please join me?" The church went completely silent. Rebecca looked up at Daniel's face and saw nothing but steady support and determination. This was it, the moment of choice that would define the rest of her life. She took his hand and stood up. Walking to the front of the church with Daniel felt like the longest journey of Rebecca's life. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, could hear the whispers starting up like a wave rolling through the congregation. But Daniel's hand was strong and steady in hers, and she drew courage from his presence. When they reached the front of the church, Daniel spoke again. "For the past several months, this community has believed a story about Miss Rebecca that is completely false. She has been condemned and shunned based on lies told to protect a guilty man." Mr. Whitfield started to stand up, his face red with anger, but Daniel continued before he could speak. "I have here a written testimony from Mrs. Patterson, who witnessed the actual events of that night behind this very church." Daniel pulled out the letter and held it up so everyone could see it. Mrs. Patterson saw Thomas Whitfield attack Miss Rebecca. She saw Rebecca fight him off and escape. She saw Thomas return to the church social as if nothing had happened. The church erupted in shocked gasps and excited whispers. Thomas had gone pale and his parents looked like they had been struck by lightning. "Furthermore," Daniel continued, raising his voice to be heard over the noise, Dr. Williams has confirmed that Miss Rebecca was not the first young woman to be assaulted by Thomas Whitfield. There have been others, but their families were too afraid of the Whitfield family's power to speak up. "This is outrageous," Mr. Whitfield shouted, finally finding his voice. "I will not stand here and listen to these slanderous lies about my son." But Rebecca was no longer the frightened, broken woman who had been hiding for months. She stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "They are not lies, Mr. Whitfield. And I am no longer afraid to tell the truth." She turned to face the congregation, looking directly at people who had shunned her, who had crossed the street to avoid her, who had whispered cruel things about her character. "Thomas Whitfield followed me outside the night of the church social. He cornered me behind the building and tried to force himself on me. When I fought him off and escaped, he and his family spread lies about me to protect his reputation. They destroyed my name, my job, my place in this community, all to cover up his crime. You can't prove any of this." Thomas finally spoke up, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "Actually, I can," Rebecca replied calmly. She nodded to Daniel, who began reading Mrs. Patterson's letter aloud. The old woman had been thorough in her testimony, describing not only what she had witnessed but also specific details about the time, the weather, and what both Rebecca and Thomas had been wearing. As Daniel read, Rebecca watched the faces in the congregation. She saw doubt creeping into expressions that had been certain of her guilt. She saw anger replacing judgment as people began to understand how completely they had been manipulated. When Daniel finished reading the letter, Dr. Williams stood up from his seat near the back of the church. "I can confirm that Mrs. Patterson's account is accurate," he said in a voice that carried clearly through the building. "And I can also confirm that Thomas Whitfield has been involved in similar incidents with other young women in this area. I treated their injuries, and I kept silent because I was afraid of the consequences. I am ashamed of my cowardice, and I ask this community's forgiveness for not speaking up sooner." 6 months later, on a warm spring morning, Rebecca stood in the same church where she had once been condemned and whispered about. But today she wore a beautiful white dress that she had sewn herself, and the church was filled with flowers and the sound of joyful voices rather than cruel gossip. The transformation had not happened overnight. In the days following the Founders' Day revelation, Willowbrook had been thrown into upheaval. Some people had immediately apologized to Rebecca and welcomed her back into the community with open arms. Others had been slower to accept that they had been wrong, struggling with embarrassment over how easily they had been manipulated by the Whitfield family's lies. The Whitfields themselves had left town within a week of the public exposure. Faced with multiple women coming forward with similar stories about Thomas, and with their business reputation in ruins, they had quietly sold their holdings and moved to another state. Thomas's engagement to Catherine Fairchild had been broken off, and the last anyone heard, he was facing legal charges in his new location for similar behavior. Rebecca had spent those months not only planning her wedding, but also rebuilding her life in ways she had never imagined possible. Daniel had purchased a beautiful piece of land just outside of town, and together they had designed and built a ranch that was already becoming one of the most successful in the county. But more than that, Rebecca had discovered that clearing her name had opened doors she thought were closed forever. The school board had approached her about returning to teaching, and several families had specifically requested that their children be placed in her classes. Dr. Williams had also asked her to consider training as a proper nurse, offering to sponsor her education in exchange for her help with his practice. Most surprisingly, Rebecca had started a support group for women who had experienced similar attacks or abuse. Word had spread beyond Willowbrook, and women from neighboring counties had begun traveling to attend meetings where they could share their stories and support each other. The group met in the back room of the church with Pastor Mitchell's full support and encouragement. Now, as Rebecca walked down the aisle toward Daniel, she reflected on how much had changed. The people filling the pews included not only friends from Willowbrook, but also women from her support group, fellow teachers, and ranchers from across the region who had come to know and respect Daniel's work. Mrs. Patterson had not lived to see this day, having passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 months after giving her testimony, but her granddaughter Amy was serving as Rebecca's flower girl, and Rebecca wore Mrs. Patterson's pearl necklace as something borrowed, a reminder of the brave woman who had finally found the courage to speak the truth. Daniel stood waiting at the altar, looking handsome in his best suit, but more importantly, looking at Rebecca with the same expression of love and respect that had first given her the courage to believe in herself again. Beside him stood Dr. Williams as his best man, the doctor having become a close friend and ally in the months since he had finally found his own courage to speak up. Pastor Mitchell performed the ceremony, his voice strong and joyful as he spoke about love, truth, and redemption. When he asked if anyone objected to the union, there was only warm laughter from the congregation, a stark contrast to the tense silence that had filled this same space during the Founders' Day confrontation. As Rebecca and Daniel exchanged vows, she promised not only to love and honor him, but also to continue standing for truth and justice in their community. Daniel promised not only to cherish and protect her, but also to support her work helping other women find their voices and their strength. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed by a congregation that had learned important lessons about the dangers of believing gossip over evidence, and about the courage required to stand up for what is right even when it is difficult. The reception was held at the new ranch, with tables set up in the main yard, and music provided by local musicians. Children ran around playing games while adults shared food and stories. It was the kind of celebration that brought a community together rather than dividing it. As the evening wore on, Rebecca found herself standing on the porch of her new home, looking out at the land that she and Daniel would work together. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the distance, and she could see the lights of Willowbrook twinkling in the valley below. "Any regrets?" Daniel asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Rebecca leaned back against his chest, feeling more content and secure than she had ever imagined possible. "About marrying you? Never. About speaking up that day at church? Never. About standing up for the truth even when it was scary? Never." She turned in his arms to face him. "Daniel, I want to tell you something I've never said before." "What's that?" "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. Thank you for showing me that I was worthy of respect and love, even when everyone else had written me off." Daniel cupped her face gently in his hands. "Rebecca, you were never invisible to me. From the first moment I saw you helping Mrs. Patterson, I could see your strength and your goodness. All I did was help you remember what was already there." As they stood together on their porch, they could hear the sounds of celebration continuing around them. Former students calling out congratulations, fellow ranchers discussing cattle prices, women from the support group sharing stories and laughter. It was the sound of a community that had learned to value truth over comfort, justice over convenience. "What do you think comes next?" Rebecca asked. "Well," Daniel said thoughtfully, "I think we build the best ranch in the county. I think you help as many women as you can find their voices and their courage. I think we raise children who know the difference between right and wrong and aren't afraid to stand up for what they believe in." Rebecca smiled, thinking about the future they would create together. "And I think we show this community that sometimes the people they want to throw away are exactly the people they need to learn from." A year later, the Cooper Ranch was indeed one of the most successful in the region. But it was known for more than just its cattle and crops. It had become a place where women could come to find work and support when they needed a fresh start. Rebecca had completed her nursing training and was working alongside Dr. Williams to provide medical care throughout the county. Her teaching had expanded beyond the classroom to include literacy classes for adults who had never had the chance to learn to read and write. The support group had grown into a formal organization that provided legal assistance, job training, and safe housing for women escaping dangerous situations. What had started as a small group meeting in the back of a church had become a model that other communities were copying. Most importantly, Thomas Whitfield's other victims had found the courage to come forward and seek justice. The legal cases were ongoing, but for the first time, these women had support and advocacy rather than shame and silence. Rebecca often thought about the woman she had been, sitting alone outside the general store, afraid to go inside and face the whispers and stares. That woman had felt worthless, damaged, and hopeless. She had believed that her life was over, that she would never again have purpose or respect or love. But that woman had been wrong about almost everything except one crucial truth. She had been innocent, and she had deserved better treatment than she received. Now, as Rebecca Cooper, successful rancher, respected nurse, advocate for justice, and beloved wife, She knew that sometimes the worst moments in life could become the foundation for the best ones.